Here we go. So this is GitHub Codespaces. Seriously, you actually can develop in a browser at this point. So I am Benjamin Day, owner of Benjamin Day Consulting. I'm based out of, oops, that's not working at all. Hang on one second. Can you see my screen, or is it completely a disaster?
I can see it's all good.
I'm glad it's good for you because it's not good for me.
Now it's gone. Okay.
Cool.
I think we see the wrong screen, which has.
Yeah.
Let's try it again. That's the wrong screen. How about that?
This is
Yes.
yeah, very good.
Good.
All right, let's see if this stays good. All right. So I'm based out of Brookline, Massachusetts, which is basically Boston. I do consulting and training. I like to think of myself as a rental chief technology officer who can still write code. So I can go deep on pretty much everything that happens on a .NET team. I also think of myself as a therapist for teams. So there's a lot of psych stuff that I feel is required to help teams actually be productive and to deliver great software. And as I'm thinking about the therapist for teams thing, I was out for a run a couple of years ago, and I thought, it's like, oh, I'm basically, what I do is I'm a therapist for teams. And I went home and I'm like, I should rebrand myself as a therapist for teams. So I went and registered therapistforteams.com on GoDaddy for like 5 years. It cost a bunch of money. And I was super excited that I was going to rebrand my company as this. And then I went to go hook up Therapist for Teams to my email server. And that was the first time I'd ever seen it all in lowercase. And I realized that it was the Rapist for Teams. And that was the moment that it's like, hey, maybe that's not actually going to work. So I do Scrum, DevOps, Azure, Team Foundation Server, Azure DevOps, all this kind of fun stuff. Microsoft MVP, right, for Pluralsight. I've got a bunch of different courses up on Pluralsight, so go start them up. I don't care if you watch them, just let them run end to end, because that's how I get paid. I'm also a Scrum.org trainer, so I teach a whole bunch of different courses via Scrum.org. Scrum.org is Ken Schwaber's company, and Ken's one of the two inventors of the Scrum process. You can find me on Twitter and heckle me if you want to, at Ben Day. And yeah, shameless plug for my courses. I've got 2 courses that went live on Pluralsight just at the end of last year. So go ahead and watch those. All right, on with the show. So the thing that's going on with GitHub Codespaces, it used to be Visual Studio Codespaces. It used to be hanging off of Azure DevOps. But for whatever reason, Microsoft decided to hang it off of GitHub. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get developer environments and make it something that people can get to very easily with a minimal amount of effort. So blazing fast cloud developer environments that get started in seconds. And if you're interested in going and drilling into all the information about it, so go to GitHub Features Codespaces, and there's a ton of information there that you can go and take a look at. Now, before I dive into the actual Codespaces thing, I kind of want to back up and talk about DevOps. Now, the DevOps is what I do for about 50% of my living as an Azure DevOps consultant. And let's think about some of the philosophy of what's going on with DevOps. So DevOps is trying to get you towards automation and repeatability, because we recognize that humans are mistake factories. So we just cannot be trusted to do the same thing twice. And doing things like deploying code into production or to whatever environment you're deploying it to, that takes a lot of work. And if it's not automated, there's a lot of places that humans can make mistakes. Also, when you get into that, you start thinking about, well, the whole effort of doing deployment is a real distraction from the real work of what you're trying to do. And that real work is developing new features and delivering great done working software. Or if we're thinking of it, how we would say it in the Scrum world is delivering business value. So that whole deploying off to environments and getting things built and deployed is just a gigantic distraction from actually working on those features. So what we try to do is we try to get automated deployment scripts So anything that's hard, we're going to automate it, and we're going to put those deployment scripts into version control. And then that becomes, well, just like anything else that goes into version control, we get to track what changes happened. And we're going to version those deployment scripts against the code that we're trying to deploy. So theoretically, everything should map to one another and should work together at any point in time in that version control system. Now, if we're going to get really, really into doing DevOps, what we want to do is we don't want to just figure out how we're going to deploy our code. We also want to think about how we define our environments. So before I started the talk, we were talking about Kubernetes and Docker and all that fun stuff. And that's, a lot of what you're doing with a Docker container is you're describing what the OS is going to be. You're describing what files are going to be there. You're describing what processes you want to start, what files need to get moved to where, what your environment variables are. There's tons of things that go into that, and they all go into those files for Docker, and that all goes into version control. Now, if you're using Azure, you've got similar things that are happening with ARM templates, so Azure Resource Manager templates, where you describe not only how you're going to deploy your code, but what the hosting environment is going to be. So thinking about Azure Resource Manager, some of the stuff I'm doing right now, we're spinning up SQL Server, we're spinning up Azure Storage, we're spinning up a whole bunch of networking stuff, Azure App Service Plans, app services, we're setting up certificates and domain names and all this kind of stuff, and it's all happening through ARM templates. So we run an automated build. We, as part of the automated build, in the automated release, we'll give it the ARM template. That'll spin up all the environment that we're going to do for hosting and then deploy the code into that environment. So all that stuff, all that config is going to go into version control. So absolutely everything that we're doing is something that can be repeatable and automated so that we're minimizing human mistakes and minimizing distractions. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as far as DevOps. And I'm going to get to Codespaces in a second. Don't worry. So let's think about what are some big things that are painful in software development. Now, as someone who does a lot of consulting, I am hopping into new teams on a pretty regular basis. And one of the things that's really painful is getting a developer workstation set up so that I can actually do my job. Because every application has like different requirements. It needs different third-party tooling. They need certain versions of compilers. They need config values in whatever places. And it just can take forever because no one's documented this stuff. It all is just sort of like, oh yeah, we do it once and we never think about it again. Well, that makes it really difficult to onboard somebody. Another thing that's painful in software development is the works on my box problem. So you develop some feature on your machine, it works just fine there, and then you check it in and somebody tries to pull that down out of version control and run it on their machine, and now suddenly nothing works anymore. Like works on your box, doesn't work anyplace else. And usually what's going on there is that there's some kind of configuration that just didn't get communicated somewhere. Another thing that can be really painful is just if your application starts getting complicated, like let's say you're doing microservices with Docker, Kubernetes, Angular, .NET Core, microservice backend. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen and a lot of hardware that is required to make that thing run. Do you really want to buy massive hardware for everybody to have on their desktop? That gets pretty expensive for a company. It gets pretty expensive for a consultant. For example, my laptop that's sitting in front of me right now costs too much money. Anyway, so those are things that are painful. And if you're thinking about the DevOps pain, we're thinking about the deployment and hosting pain. But what would be really nice is if we could start addressing some of the pain points that we've got for the developer side, just like we would do for something that we would, run into that was painful in DevOps. So this comes into Codespaces. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the developer workstation under version control. So what code's required? What Git repos are we going to pull from? What tooling is required? What version of .NET Core? What version of Java, Angular, NPM, whatever? What do we need to have installed on that machine to make it run? What are the setup scripts in order to get the application running? And I'm sure that you could think of another 10 items that you would run into for getting your workstation set up. Well, we're going to put that into the config for Codespaces. Addressing that cost of ownership, well, why not just rent your developer workstation? So if it's running in the cloud, as opposed to you have to buy a physical piece of hardware, well, it's probably cheaper to rent it than it is to own it. Now, this sort of switches it around so that your local machine, if you're using Codespaces, becomes a lot less important. And if you've got all this stuff scripted out and put into version control, then it's really easy for someone to become productive on your project. Now, Codespaces is really thinking a lot about how do you get open source projects so that people can contribute to them. I think that that's where they really started out thinking about this cloud-based development environment, is they want someone to be able to just come to whatever project that's caught their eye on GitHub and be able to run it and become productive on that open source project, so that they can contribute to it, potentially submitting pull requests and getting GitHub credit for that stuff. But it also works really well for any other application. It makes it easy if you've got all this stuff mapped out inside of version control. It's easy for someone to join your company and become productive. All right, before I go too much further, does anyone have any thoughts, questions, comments on what I've got so far? Going once, going twice. All right. So what is a code space? Well, at its essence, it's a container that's running in the cloud. And it's going to be well, I'll get to it in a second. So you got that container running in the cloud. And what you'll do is you're going to connect to it remotely from whatever machine you've got using either Visual Studio Code or just a simple browser. And then if you connect with the browser, you get Visual Studio Code, the web version of it, which if you didn't realize that existed, it's unbelievably cool that how much that actually works with that. So that container, I know someone is thinking about this. Is this what flavors of containers do you have? Well, they're all Ubuntu. So they're all Linux containers. So if you're doing .NET Core development, you're fine. But if you're doing .NET Framework development, you're probably going to have a bad time. But pretty much anything that you want to develop that runs on Ubuntu, you can do in this code space. Really nice for web applications. So .NET Core, ASP.NET, Blazor, Node applications are really good in this. Java apps are good. Python supported in there. Pretty much everything is in there. And what's also kind of nice as we're thinking about microservice architectures is that you can also run other containers within this container. So if you have some sprawling microservice architecture that you need to run, well, you can just do it up in the code space. Now, minor details. This is running out of GitHub, and at present, it's only available for paid subscriptions. And it makes sense that it's for paid subscriptions for GitHub because, well, they are going to be incurring actual costs running VMs and containers in the back end for you to use. So you need either a GitHub Team subscription or a GitHub Enterprise Cloud subscription. Another minor detail is you need to have right access to the repository you want to use, which kind of makes sense because you have to commit your Codespace files back to that repo. And final one, this is the one that's kind of tricky. It actually needs to be enabled for your GitHub subscription. Now, you can turn that on yourself, but you have to remember to actually do it. Minor details on pricing options. So when I pulled this about 2 weeks ago, here's what it costs. It's not particularly expensive, and you can get up to 32 core, 64 gigs of RAM for under $3 an hour, which is, if you think about it, pretty cheap for that kind of a developer machine. Especially since you're probably going to use it for 8 hours a day, 20 days a month or something, which is a lot cheaper to do that than it is to go out and buy a new MacBook Pro or something like that, or a Mac Studio. Storage is billed 7 cents per gigabyte per month, so it's about market rate for storage. Now, the compute stuff, the Codespace compute is billed while it's running, but the Codespace storage is billed even when it's inactive, because, well, they've got drives somewhere with your stuff, and you're renting those drives, even if you're not renting the processors that are going to service the stuff that's on those drives. Make sense? All right. So how do we enable Codespaces? It's in the docs. So here's the link. It didn't word wrap all that well, but it's there if you want to download the slides. It's not particularly hard to find the guide, but I thought that it's a little confusing. So learning Codespaces and working with Codespaces, it's available. It's an RTM'd, launched, publicly available product, but I think that there are still a lot of places where it's a little, how do you say it? It's a little sharp. It's got some sharp edges. So setting it up is one of those places that I thought was kind of sharp. So what you'll do, I'll just walk you through with some slides. In the upper right-hand corner of your GitHub thing, you've got your little pretty picture of yourself. Pull that, and one of the options under that menu is organizations. So choose organizations. It shows you the organizations that you're attached to. In the case of what I'm working on, I want to enable Codespaces for my Benday Inc. Tenant. So you click on settings for that. Then we're going to come down a little bit, and on the left-hand side, there's a section that says Codespaces. So you'll turn on Codespaces for your users that you want to use Codespaces with. So in this case, only me, but I could allow it for all people in the organization, and I could theoretically open it up to people that are outside my organization if I wanted to start paying for that. Another thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you've got a paid subscription. So you go to billing and plans, and then as you see that, you'll see whether or not you're on some sort of a plan. So I'm on GitHub Enterprise Plan. And if you scroll down on that page a bit, you have to set something called a spending limit. So you go to Codespaces, and you'll have this thing right here. You click on the update button, the update link. That'll take you in for setting a monthly spending limit. And I had mine set to $100 a month, which I think is probably a good amount, because if you forget to turn it off, you're still getting charged for it. So you potentially could be spending some real money if you just leave it running. But you also have the option of having unlimited spending if you want to live dangerously. All right, any questions on setting this up before I dive into some demos? How am I doing? Can you all hear me still? I'm not just talking to myself.
Yeah, we heard you.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Good, good. Thank you.
All right. So let's go do some demos. So I'm going to go to my Benday Inc. Subscription inside of Azure DevOps. And just to make this work, I'm going to do a new repository. Let's call it Chicago Codespaces 1. I'll set it up with a git ignore. And then say create repository. All right. So looking at this, you're going to be like, where is the Codespaces thing? How do I turn it on? And it's a little bit hidden. So you go to the code thing right here, and it's defaulted me into Codespaces. But here's a thought. So if you click on code and you don't see the Codespaces tab, that's an indication that you have not enabled Codespaces for your account. So you'd go through, start up here, go to organizations, and then go through those steps that are inside of that, inside the PowerPoint. All right. So if you want to create a new Codespace, I'll click on Codespaces and then say new Codespace. Choose the amount of horsepower that I want. So I'm going to choose 4 cores, 8 gigs of RAM, and 32 gigs of storage. And it's building the container for me. And it dumps me into this. This looks a surprisingly large amount like Visual Studio Code, right? It's Visual Studio Code in the web. Now, one of the things that we get immediately is this thing down here. It's giving me a little warning saying that settings sync is off. So if you haven't looked into doing settings sync inside of Visual Studio Code, you really should check it out. Because what it allows you to do is all your extensions, all your code snippets, all your preferences get synced into either a Microsoft account or into a GitHub account so that it works on any machine that you log into. So I'm going to turn setting sync on. I'm going to say replace my local settings with my cloud settings. And you're going to start seeing a bunch of stuff pop up. So all the extensions that I use regularly on my machines, they all start to show up here. Now, almost every extension that you run into works in the web version. There are definitely some, though, that don't work on the web. So I don't have a definitive list of what those are, but there are some that don't work. But most of them do. So like your Docker stuff, a lot of your Azure stuff, GitHub obviously works, testing tools, debugging tools, database tools, SQL Server tools, they all work. And it's pretty nice. Additionally, let's do snippets. Configure user snippets. And if I go to my C# snippets, I've got all my snippets that I have on every other machine have now just synced down. All right. So let's come into the terminal window on this. So remember, I'm still running inside the browser. And let's do dir. There's not much in here. And let's go and start creating a solution. So let's do Vende Codespaces sample. And I'll say .NET new SLN. And as we go through this, you start seeing, well, all the files are showing up. They're getting staged and set up inside of Git. So if we want to commit stuff, we can. Let's create another thing in here. Oops. Vende Codespaces demo or sample. Create a web project. So I'll say .NET new MVC. Let's add that project into the solution. So .NET SLN add. And there, I think we've got it. Yep. So let's make sure it actually compiles. We'll do .NET build. And just like what we'd expect on any other machine, it just starts compiling. It just works. It's the command prompt for .NET Core. So let's go ahead and check this stuff in. So if we go over to the version control tab, you see all of our pending files are in here. And let's say created basic SLN structure. Click that, click sync changes. And now if we go back over to the GitHub view, all our stuff is up here in GitHub. So we just pushed it out of that VM, out of that container, and committed it up to Git. So next thing, actually, any questions so far? Keep going. All right. So now let's actually prove that we can debug this thing. We can run this thing. So we'll say .NET. Where am I? .NET run. And that spins up the application running inside that container, or inside the container. Now, what you'd be thinking is, okay, well, how do we actually go and debug this? Well, one of the tabs we get is the ports tab. So if we click on this link, this will open it in a browser, and it's going to bomb. And if I do this, I think this is going to say 502 error. Yeah, 502 bad gateway. So what's going on here is Codespaces detects what you've got as far as, where's my terminal? What ports are being used inside of that, and it tries to guess as best it can at how to map those. So what it does is it will create these internet endpoints that map back to the ports inside the container. Now, you're probably thinking, are these available to everybody at this point? The answer is no. By default, it's privately mapped. So you have to auth with your GitHub account in order to access that endpoint. But you have some options. So if you right click on it and you say port visibility, you've got private. So that's a default. So only you can access it. Private to organization. So people in your org can access it. Or public, which would mean anybody can access it. So that's a way of controlling that visibility and the permissions for that. Another thing that you want to think about, and let's think about this 502 bad gateway. So if you run into this, this usually means that there's something wrong with the protocol mapping. So I'm trying to map port 7080. And if I right click on this and I look at the port protocol, right now it's trying to map an HTTP port, and that's not going to work. We need to map it as a HTTPS. So it's now set as HTTPS. Let's close that down. And let's go try to run this again. And this should just pick it up after a few seconds. Here we go. And there's our application running inside of that container in the cloud. So anything we want to do, like let's come down here and let's stop running this. We'll kill that off. Let's just make a simple change to one of the views. Save that off. And let's come back down here and say run. Wrong directory. So that should be mapped at that point. Come back over here to refresh, and that change shows up. All right, so we've got a nice development environment that's happening up here in the cloud. And let's go back over to terminal and let's kill off that process. And one of the things that you can do, let's go down to this thing that says Codespaces. So this indicates that you're running in a code space. One of the options you have is to open this thing in VS Code. So I'm going to say, yep, open it in VS Code. And we see down here in the bottom left, it's saying opening remote code space. What this is doing for us is this somehow is connecting into that container so that we can use the full version of Visual Studio Code, so the compiled version, against that code space in the cloud. So we're taking advantage of the compute in the cloud to do all kinds of stuff. So if you look right here, we've got that pending change that I made where I added the H1 high. And that's up in the cloud, but it looks here in Visual Studio Code as if it's something that's local. But let's make this, commit this change. So push that up. And if we go back over into our browser, we see that it reflects exactly the same thing for source control, because this is looking at the exact same disk as what we're seeing here inside of our Visual Studio Code version. All right. Now, one of the things that can be nice about this is that there are some features that work better inside of Visual Studio Code than it does in the cloud. One of them that I have found is setting up the task.json and the launch.json. So let's do task.json. And we'll say configure build task. And that's the wrong thing. Here we go. All right, .NET, generate assets for build and debug. And it does a pretty good job of actually picking up what we're supposed to have, and it generates these for us automatically. So if we come into this and we say build, run build task, that now is picking up these build and launch things. So if I want to come over here and let's launch our application. And what's nice here is using this to launch our application gives us a way of launching into debug mode. So let's over here, open the browser. That's not going to work. All right, so now we have this thing running inside of that browser. If we come over to, let's go to controllers. Let's just put a breakpoint on that. Come back over here and let's refresh. Of course, because people are looking at it, it's not going to work. Pretend that that actually worked. Let's go up to the cloud and do it. Nope. Let's restart it. Yep. Well, it's not working. All right, pretend that that just worked and it was amazing. Round of applause for how great that was. Let's try launching it out of this instead. So if we go over to controllers, I'd be curious to see, does it have the breakpoint? No. Set the breakpoint right there. Let's try running it again. Now, one of the things that I have definitely found is that sometimes it gets a little crabby about the port stuff. So sometimes I need to just toggle the ports on and off as being HTTPS. Here we go. And now I've hit my breakpoint. And if I come over here to my watch window and say this, I get all my debugging stuff showing up right here. So that's pretty much a full development environment, all running directly in the cloud. Ooh, that crashed. That's fun. I'm going to close that down, commit my changes. All right, does anyone have any questions about what I've done so far? Or anything you want to ask me to try to demo? All right. Well, some other stuff that is worth looking into is right now, this is just a simple development environment, but let's go and create a file. And let's say start SQL server.sh. And I'm going to paste in some stuff into this. All right. So if you want to do anything that's actually useful, you'd probably have to have a database in here. So let's come down into terminal. And do a change mod a plus x. So this just lets this be an executable file. Start SQL server.sh. And now let's run start SQL server sh. It pulls SQL Server down. Starts running it in a container. And in a second, we should have an actual database application, a database running up here in the cloud that we can develop against. So that's running right there. And you'll see that Codespaces tries to map that port 1433 outside of that container. I have had real limited success trying to connect to that using any other external SQL Server tools. So what I've been doing instead is just using the SQL Server extension for Visual Studio Code. And let's try to see if we can connect. Unable to do that. All right, let's get rid of that previous connection and start over. Here we go. All right, and now we've got a running SQL Server running inside of a container inside of this Codespaces container. So now if you think about what you can do once you have that, well, you can develop whatever you want to do. You want to start doing entity framework applications in here, you can. Totally straightforward thing to do. You want to run stored procs or develop stored procedures, you can do that. If you want to start doing SQL Server database projects and committing that stuff into Git, you can do that too. Other things you might want to do would be running Azure storage. So for that, I'd probably use an Azurite container. If I'm going to try to do something with Cosmos DB, you can use the Cosmos DB Linux emulator and have that work. But you can, with containers, you can do all kinds of cool stuff inside of this code space. All right. Thoughts on that? All right. Well, to prove to you that this is not just magic, I'm going to open up this link right here. And I think I put it into my slides. Let's see if it's in there. Map reports, test.json, Reddit. Oh, actually, one thing to do while I'm in here, let's commit this change. Kick that in there, commit it. And let's come back over to my repository. And if I just want to look at my repository using Visual Studio Code, and I don't want to have an actual VM backing up my code space, I can just go up to my URL, and where it says github.com and then it has that URL, change it to github.dev. Exactly the same URL, except for the fact that you're going to .dev. And this will give you a code editor so you can go in and start working with stuff. So let's just go over to GitHub for a second and let's look at something that I have never done, never tried this with. So here is one of my GitHub actions that I have. So just shameless plug, I've got a bunch of free actions that you can use inside of GitHub Actions pipelines. So if you're interested in that, you can go look at my stuff, use it for free. So if you just want to come in here and you're like, oh, I want to look at, C# or I want to look at how does this thing actually work, just flip this over to .dev. And now it's a whole lot easier to see what's actually happening inside of someone else's code. So if I'm curious about how my action works, or just come in here, go to the repo, change it to .dev, and then you get a decent looking view into this repo. All right. That wasn't the only thing I wanted to show you like that. Let's come down a little bit further. So inside of Codespaces, Codespaces is using a bunch of containerization config files. And in my slides, I've got a link to exactly what I'm going to show you right now. So this the master definition for Codespaces. So if I come over to that URL, let's close that out. This has the default configuration for what is happening inside of all those code spaces. So when you create a code space, this is what it actually starts using. And the important stuff is happening inside of the .dev container folder. And you'll see things like, well, there's an actual Docker file and there's a base.docker file. So you can see exactly what goes into building your code space. There's another file inside of here. So we've got the .dev container file, and then we've got dev container.json file. So this does a bunch of runtime configuration for your container. But this does it for everybody's stuff. Now, what I was saying before, where you want to be able to do some interesting stuff inside of your code spaces, well, you can create your own customized dev container.json files and start customizing what goes into it. And this is where you would start putting the setup for whatever application you're trying to create a dev environment for. So it would go into dev container.json. So let's come back over to this code space, and I'm going to open it up in VS Code again. And let's add something. So you say search for dev container, and we can say add development container configuration files. And it's got a whole bunch of pre-baked things that you can do. So I'm just going to choose C# and MS SQL. Choose the defaults, and it's going to give me options for adding in a whole bunch of different optional features. So I'm going to do GitHub CLI, GitHub large file support, Azure CLI. Let's do Homebrew, PowerShell, and let's see, anything else? Yeah, it's good enough for right now. Hit OK. And now this has just generated a dev container.json file and a bunch of supporting files in here. And what I think is probably one of the most important things in that dev container.json file is the post create command. It's basically the event that gets called when it spins up your environment. And so what it's going to do here is it runs this post create command shell script. And then this does a whole bunch of stuff that sets up SQL Server, sets up all these different other tools in the environment. So I'm going to commit this. So added dev container.json. Push that up. And I'm going to say rebuild container. So I give it an option, rebuild container. That's going to nuke the current running container. And then it's going to regenerate it using the changes I put into that dev container.json. So we should get some interesting things showing up in our log. Here it comes, start spinning that stuff up.
So in the meantime, Benjamin, there's a question in the chat.
Sure.
Is it easy to use Secret Manager to protect things like DB passwords in the startup?
You mean stuff like adding a secret into your GitHub account?
Yeah, just so you don't have to put that database password in there.
Yeah, I haven't actually looked into that, but I would expect that just gets injected in as an environment variable.
Okay.
They would have had to thought about that because GitHub is really, like, they run scans. Like one of the Dependabot scans is going to be whether or not you've committed a password into your repo.
Right. Thanks.
All right, so the first time that you generate this, it takes a little bit of time. I think rather than prove to you that it all works, I think I'd probably just want to wrap it up and let you have the rest of your night to yourself. Let's see, is I actually going to spin up right now? Now, let's go just go over some of this stuff. All right, so just backing up and going through the demos that I did. So first thing that I did was create a new repository, created a code space for that repo, connected using a browser, added some .NET code, did a commit to GitHub, did some builds, and most importantly, I think is, at least for making my life nice as a developer, is I turned on settings sync and it pulled my settings down so that I have a familiar environment to work in. We kept on working with the browser. We added some tasks.json and launch.json. I created that using Visual Studio Code, running on the desktop. That made it a little bit easier, but we ran the app, did some port mapping, did some basic debugging, and then, like I said, ran it in full Visual Studio Code. Showed you the little trick of just changing the URL to .dev, and then you get the Visual Studio web version, editing your application or viewing your code. Some stuff about databases, pulling that SQL Server container. Hang on one second. Oh, hang on one second. I'm just going to finish up my talk and then I'll be right there. My daughter is coming in just to say hi. She's going to bed. She's 4. So showed you how to create a script, pulls down that SQL Server container, runs it. And then finally, we dug into how you can start customizing using devcontainer.json and viewing the way that devcontainer.json works for creating everybody's code spaces. So that link right there shows you the master code space definition at GitHub. So let's see, did this come back? This thing is still running. But basically, it's still all there. All right. So I think there's another question.
Yeah, there's one more question in the chat. If you have a microservices architecture and each microservice has its own repo,
yep.
do you need a dev container for each repo that would start up the rest of the microservice that your repo would need to interact?
I think what I would probably do for that is I'd consider, so you'd have the repo that has your code space in it, and maybe there's some code in there. What I would consider doing then would just be cloning those additional repos down. It should work just like anything else. Or you could, what's the other thing? That's like the sub repos or something like that. You could probably look into that, make that work. But yeah, just clone other repos into your existing code space and it should just work. Does that answer the question on that one? All right.
I was mainly kind of wondering, like, if you're kind of working on one repo at a time, then, right? So like if the rest of, if you were trying to say debug an interaction between 2 microservices or something, you pretty much have to have 2 dev container instances going on 2 separate repos, but then
I don't think you would. You'd probably just clone the 2 repos down into your dev container, and then however you're doing your microservices, you just, if you can run Kubernetes inside this thing, and then however you choose to debug that is kind of up to you, and it should just work. That's a famous quote fingers, like, should just work.
Yeah.
But Brian, are you the guy? Did you remind me that my SSL certificate was broken?
Yeah, I was trying to check out your talk beforehand.
Thank you very much for that. Like that ended up causing me a lot of sweats and nervousness. But thank you for letting me know that my SSL certificate on my website had expired. Like I couldn't believe that I had let that go, because I've had it. I've had the cert for like 2 months. And so I've known this is coming, and it just slipped my mind. So thank you very much on that. That was incredibly helpful. All right. Any other last questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me to come give this talk. I guess it's going to be up on YouTube. And also, I've already posted the slides. I gave this talk last week. So the slides are up on my blog. So www.benday.com/blog, and you can go download that stuff. And yeah, email me or tweet at me if you got any questions. And
Hey, Benjamin, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So my question is, do you know how's the demand? Is it a lot of people are using, or it's selling like a hotcake? Do you have that insight?
I don't any
Okay.
idea. I know
Okay.
that anecdotally, because I don't work
Okay.
for Microsoft, I don't work for
Yeah.
GitHub. What I've heard is that more and more people at GitHub are using Codespaces to develop stuff for GitHub. So
Mhm.
they're dog fooding it pretty hard.
Okay. So when they first launched it, I requested for invite. I never received a response until now.
Oh, really?
So yeah, maybe there's a lot of backlog or they forgot. I don't know what's going
Well,
on.
there was definitely a lot of initial demand for the beta,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
they just didn't. I mean, they didn't want to have 52 trillion people working.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right. Any other questions? Cool.
Hi, Ben. This is Steve. I have one question. So is this, can basically, let's say somebody has like a nice iPad with a big screen and a keyboard, can they pretty much be productive doing development with this?
Yeah, I have tried that out myself. So I've got I don't have it with me. I've got the iPad Pro with the nice keyboard, the one that costs $300 from Apple, that has a trackpad and everything. I can be pretty productive with that, but what I run into is that there are no function keys. So F5, F10, F11, all those debug things that we're used to don't work. But if you just grab a keyboard and plug it in, or pair it using Bluetooth, if you just get a regular Mac keyboard, it works just fine, and it's amazing. It's just kind of stupid that you can develop so effectively on an iPad. So it's weird times we live in.
Cool.
That is cool indeed.
Yeah. I was thinking about trying to do that as a demo for this talk, but I couldn't really figure out how to make it work without it being a big hassle to reconnect. But maybe I'll figure that out sometime. All right. Well, I think I'm gonna end it there. I'm gonna go put my daughter to bed, and yeah, ping me if you got any questions.
Thank you very much, Benjamin.